You're listening to Dairy Voice by Dairy Business News, a podcast exclusively for the dairy industry.
One of our sponsors of the Dairy Voice podcast is National DHIA. NDHIA ensures information accuracy and represents their members' interests. They are the direct voice for the dairy information industry. To find out more, go to dhia.org.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Wherever you are in your day, welcome to the Dairy Voice podcast by Dairy Business News. I'm your host, Connie Kuber with Sealpro Silage Barrier Films by Connor Agriscience. Thanks for joining us today. Please like, subscribe, and share this podcast with your friends. And today we've got a couple of experts on that are raring to share their research on colostrum feeding. And for those of you in the dairy world that might be out harvesting silage today, be careful, have a great harvest, and enjoy the podcast. We all know that starting babies off right is important, and we go to great lengths to get newborns growing, get their immunity going, and to keep them on track to thriving and get them going as soon as possible. So today on Dairy Voice, my guests are Dr. Don Sockett, who is an epidemiologist and microbiologist for the University of Wisconsin Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory. Also with us today is Dr. Tom Earleywine, who is Director of Nutritional Services for Purina Animal Nutrition. Welcome to both of you to the Dairy Voice podcast. Don, let's start with you.
Well, my name's Don Sockett. I'm a Canadian. I went to veterinary school at the University of Guelph. Then I moved to the United States and I did my internship at the University of Minnesota, my residency in large animal medicine and surgery at Colorado State University. Then I came to Madison, Wisconsin, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, did my PhD, and I worked in the state veterinarian's office for a few years, and then I worked at the diagnostic lab since 1995. My job responsibilities are predominantly dairy cattle, and I spend an inordinate amount of time working on dairy calf health issues.
Tom
Earleywine. I actually grew up in southern Wisconsin. I was youngest of four boys on a dairy farm, so my job was the most important one, of course, feeding calves. At least that's what I try to think anyway. I got all three degrees from the University of Wisconsin in dairy science, and have spent most of my career working with young animals in general, especially calves. About 35 years in milk replacer or thereabouts, and have a passion for taking care of calves.
Successful dairy professionals get it. Optimizing feed efficiency is key to optimizing milk production, and that's especially important when margins are tight. What you put into your herd's ration is essential to the performance you see later. That starts with fermentation in the rumen, which supports increased milk production and milk component yield. Talk to your Purina representative today about adding Purina Animal Nutrition's efficiency fermentation product to your herd's ration.
Okay, so let's just jump right in. What improvements do you see that could be made to current colostrum feeding practices for newborn calves? I know we have, within a certain number of hours, we're supposed to get a certain number of quarts in. Where do you think that we could make improvements?
Well, that's a good question, and a little bit of background for people to know. The current colostrum feeding recommendations, which were absolutely necessary and well done, are now a little over 2 decades old. And I have the privilege to work at a veterinary diagnostic lab, and we see complications that we've seen on calves that are fed these large volumes of colostrum. Some of the complications that we've seen is actual physical trauma or injury to the esophagus or the pharynx from the tubing procedure itself. And then if they're tube fed or nursed an exceptionally large volume of colostrum, which means that 10% of their body weight or more with the first feeding, the calves will get abdominal distension. They can't have transient pain, which lasts for up to half an hour. But in some cases, and it doesn't happen that often, but when it does, particularly after the second feeding, some calves will form a large curd of colostrum in their abomasum itself that is larger than it should be, and you get over distension of the abomasum, which leads to intense pain and colic, and some calves actually can succumb from that. What we've learned with our studies and stuff is that our goal is to feed the correct mass of immunoglobulin so we have excellent transfer of passive immunity, but feed it in the smallest volume possible. That's the gist of what we're talking about.
You recently connected a study measuring colostrum Ig concentration then using a Brix refractometer. And I'm certain that your statement before came from this research. Can you tell us about that?
What we decided to do is a true story. I was asked to give a talk about colostrum at a producer meeting, and I don't know how the dairyman got my personal phone number, but he called me early in the morning, just before 5 a.m. in the morning. He said, I got a calf that I need to feed colostrum within 2 hours, as you told me, but I have a Brix score of 20.5, and you tell me it's supposed to be 22% or higher. What should I do? That made me realize we really need a full colostrum program, because we need to tell the dairyman what to do when the colostrum is not of sufficient quality for the calves. So that led to the design of a study. The study design was different than most studies, but what we did basically was the farmers screened colostrum on the farm, and we got a whole range of different Brix scores from low, medium, and high. And they recorded the results and they sent the samples to us. And then what we did is we repeated the Brix testing at the laboratory, and then we actually measured with a laboratory test what is the IgG or immunoglobulin G concentration in the colostrum itself. And we went through and did the data analysis and everything, and we learned a couple interesting things. First off, we learned it's possible to have more than one fixed Brix cutoff. Now it's 22%, but we provide the cutoffs for 19, 25, 50, 75, and 100 grams of immunoglobulin. There's some more options for people to use that. The other thing that we learned, which was very interesting, was we were amazed and very happy that the values that we got from the producers who use a Misco Brix refractometer were virtually identical to what we saw in the samples that arrived at the laboratory. So what we call in science, we call that the Brix instrument has high precision, which means it doesn't matter who does the testing, where it's done, you will basically get the same answer as long as you use a good digital refractometer that's properly calibrated. And then the other thing we learned from the study is, which has not been talked a lot about, is what does a Brix score of 22% actually mean? Because many of the current recommendations say you should use samples with a Brix score of 22% or higher. What we learned from the study was the Brix refractometer, you cannot use it to predict the actual amount of immunoglobulin that's present in that colostrum. So what does a Brix score actually tell you? All it tells you is that you got high confidence that there's at least 50 grams per liter of immunoglobulin IgG in that colostrum sample. It's probably much higher than that, but all it is telling you that you got reasonable assurance there's at least 50 grams per liter.
Okay, so it's not a direct number, but it's a indicator of what level the IgG is at.
It tells you the minimum amount. That's
okay. The minimum.
High probability the minimum amount there, but it's probably more than the minimum amount.
Hi, I'm Tim Hammerich. Looking for your next podcast? Check out the Fresh Cow Files from Zoetis, where we'll discuss hot industry topics including antibiotic stewardship, employee training, transition cow periods, and more.
If you show that you're invested in this farm and that you care about those things like consistency and reaching production goals and reaching reproduction goals, and then invest in your employees, you will have a more productive, a more efficient, more profitable farm.
So if you're ready for some eye-opening insights, I sincerely hope you'll join us on the Fresh Cow Files, available wherever you listen to podcasts.
Now, Tom, you had talked about feeding calves when you were a young guy and that it was a very important job, that you felt like it was a very important job. What tips do you have for producers to raise these healthy, resilient calves?
Well, first off, is as all dairy producers know, it starts with the mothers. So you want the mothers to have proper dry period nutrition, body score, all that kind of stuff. But one thing that's very important is the calves have to be born into a clean environment. And we published a study in 2023 where we showed when you take a stall and you remove the bedding material and replace it with new bedding material, what are you really doing? And what we found was when you put new straw down in a contaminated environment, the straw very quickly gets recontaminated with the pathogens that are in the environment of the pen. So you can't count on the straw to provide an effective barrier to calves from infectious agents, particularly bacteria. So that's really important, and it's really important to have proper clean and sanitation of the calf pens and the calf feeding equipment. All that stuff is very, very important. And the last point is, now we have the Brix refractometer, and it's a very high precision instrument. We can use that to develop a robust colostrum management program where we can be more precise and have higher precision and feeding the correct mass of hemoglobin that the calves need, but we can also feed it in a smaller volume.
Do we know what that volume is?
That's an excellent question. All I can tell you is that when study has been done, and it depends on the size of the calf, obviously, but if you take a typical Holstein heifer calf, most of them, if you allow them to nurse within 2 hours after birth with a bottle and nipple, most of them will nurse about 2.5 quarts, 2.5 to 3 quarts. Some, but not many, can drink up to 4 quarts. And what people need to understand is, so that's why they're tubed, because they don't, a high proportion of calves will not drink 4 quarts of colostrum. Producers need to understand when they nurse, that colostrum is deposited directly in the true stomach, which we call the abomasum. If you tube them, the esophageal groove does not close, and it's deposited directly into what we call the forestomachs, or the reticular rumen. And the reticular rumen is half the size of the abomasum at birth. It's non-functional, and it basically doesn't do much. We've seen problems, and documented here, of problems of inflammation in the reticular rumen, and we believe it's from a residual of colostrum related to the tubing process. So typically, the reticular rumen can hold up to 400 milliliters to 500 milliliters of colostrum. Then the remainder will spill over into the abomasum.
Which part of the stomach is it that most of the absorption takes place?
The absorption takes place in the small intestine. So the colostrum has to enter the abomasum, and then it has to leave the abomasum, which we call abomasal emptying, and then it's absorbed in the small intestine.
Okay. So we're talking about measuring. We're talking about a clean environment. Let's talk about the management of the colostrum itself. It's the foundation that sets the calf up. How can your research findings help inform producers of the new gold standard that you're setting?
Yeah. And we have a second publication where we published a case report for a calf, and I'll give you a brief history of it. The calf was an 88-pound Holstein heifer calf that was born at 2 a.m. in the morning. It was fed 10% of its body weight of colostrum, 4 quarts, within 2 hours after birth. 6 hours later, the calf was tube fed an additional 2 quarts of colostrum. And within an hour to 90 minutes later, the calf colicked. And the calf remained in severe, persistent colic for a period of up to 24 hours. It wasn't getting any better. And the calf was euthanized and brought up to our laboratory, because the veterinarian said, I've seen this in other calves, and I've seen it in my other herds. We just want to know what's causing this. And so what happened was, when the board-certified veterinary pathologist opened up the calf and started looking around, they quickly determined that the cause of the colic was an extremely large curd of colostrum located in the abomasum, causing overdistension, which caused the immense pain, and that's why the calf colics so severely. What we're recommending for a robust colostrum management program is concentrated, more smaller volume is what's best for the calf. Mm-hmm. You won't have as many complications. It's very important because it's what's best for the calf. The second thing is, what you need to understand is, the more concentrated the colostrum is, the higher concentration of immunoglobulin, the more efficiently it's absorbed from the small intestine. So if you took 200 grams of immunoglobulin and fed the calf in 2 quarts versus 200 grams in 4 quarts, that calf that was fed, even though it's the same colostrum, same time, same everything, that calf that was fed 2 quarts will have much higher levels of serum antibody that you can measure 1 to 2 days after it was fed. So smaller volume is better for the calf, more concentrated, it's more efficiently absorbed, and so a higher proportion of the colostrum is absorbed. You have to understand that when you feed colostrum to calves, it's only a proportion of it's actually absorbed. So typically, you'll see numbers 30 to 40% of the colostrum that's actually fed, the immunoglobulin fed, will be absorbed. The second thing is there's been 4 or 5 studies that we're aware of, which showed that when the volumes get too large, which 4 quarts is in a typical Holstein heifer calf, the efficiency of absorption declines. There's been studies, same calves, same weight, same everything, where they took calves and they fed them either 7%, 8.5%, or 10% of body weight, and they measured serum IgG 24 hours later, and lo and behold, the calves that were fed 8.5% of body weight had 20% higher serum immunoglobulin levels than the calves that were fed 10% of their body weight. And there was no difference in this serum antibody levels from the calves that were fed 7 or 10% of body weight. So we call that the volume effect. So large volumes are actually is contraindicated because you're defeating the purpose of what you're trying to achieve, because we want the highest efficiency absorption possible. The last thing is, if you feed a smaller volume of colostrum that's more concentrated, you're going to increase your farm supply of colostrum significantly. So in our study, give you an example why I say that. We had one cow, she was the 3rd lactation cow. She produced a little over 6 liters of colostrum. And when we checked it, the immunoglobulin concentration was 298 grams per liter. The current recommendations are you should feed that calf 6 liters. Well, 1 liter is enough to meet the requirements of the calf. So why would you waste 5 liters of your colostrum? It makes no sense. And so what we recommend you to do is feed a smaller volume of very concentrated colostrum. You'll increase your farm supply of colostrum, and you can use it like transition milk to improve the health and well-being of the calves. Or if you want to, you can sell it and make some extra money.
What are the potential benefits that you see for dairy farmers who adopt these practices?
This is Tom. Dr. Sockett did a nice job of leading me right into what those benefits are. I'll just give a little background. First of all, 4 years ago, I was part of a group that came up with the kind of the new gold standards for what should be transfer of passive immunity in these calves. And I quickly realized that those new standards, there were 2 challenges. One is that they didn't think about or assess accurately the quality of that colostrum fed. In fact, as Dr. Sockett pointed out, what they called high quality colostrum was actually below average. And so that's how we ended up with kind of everybody feeding 4 quarts or tubing 4 quarts. And we're not against using esophageal feeder to get a colostrum into them. I don't want to give our listeners any of that impression at all. It's just as a matter of the total volume of whether you go that direction. And then the other challenge that came up was I realized just that total colostrum supply that would be needed to meet those standards was going to be a challenge. And then in the next 2-3 years, along came research from Michigan State and University of Guelph in Canada that started talking about all the potential other uses of colostrum, including feeding it as a mimicking of transition milk so that the calf could have some extended time feeding some of this colostrum for better gut health and gut development even in the first few days of life. You think about it, when the cow produces colostrum, she doesn't immediately switch to just normal milk. She gradually transitions. Using colostrum for that purpose is another great use of colostrum. And along comes another study from Guelph that showed that colostrum can be a great treatment for scours. When calves scours, it actually reduced the amount of time that they scoured, as well as improved gains on those calves, as well as the feeding of the transition milk. So I quickly realized I was between a rock and a hard place, so to speak, in that we need more colostrum, and everybody, especially, and this is a perfect time of year to be talking about this, especially this time of year, colostrum supplies tend to wane. They tend to be low. In fact, you'll hear Jersey breeders talk about the fact they get no colostrum out of sometimes other Jersey calves this time of year in particular. And so we knew that the colostrum supply was part of the challenge. All that dawned on me at that point, and Dr. Sockett comes to me and talks to me about these calves that have these challenges with 4 quarts. I had just been at a calf operation and helped them tube feed some calves colostrum, and quickly realized while I was there that after about 2.5 quarts, those calves started to be very, very restless and clearly not comfortable at that point. Now, some of it's the time it takes, but some of it is just the distension of the rumen and the abomasum because of that total volume you're trying to squeeze into a small compartment. As Dr. Sockett and I got together, we got to the point of we need to come up with a better solution. As Dr. Sockett has been talking about, we came up with this idea of how can we better predict the quality of the colostrum, which Dr. Sockett did an awesome study and developed a model to do that, in particular to assess the quality of the colostrum, but also be able to look at ways we could then use that model then to feed these calves an adequate amount of IgG relative to their body weight. And as a result, we would hopefully improve calf health, because not only making sure we get the proper amount of colostrum into all these calves, not worrying about short supply and that part of it, but also because we could use this colostrum for other purposes. Also, simply just reduce the morbidity, mortality of these calves and improve their well-being in general. Now we have at least an opportunity to maybe use colostrum for some of these other purposes, as Dr. Sockett mentioned, whether it's feeding transition milk, using the colostrum to mimic transition milk, or to treat scallops. Just doing a better job of strategically managing our colostrum supply will help with calf health and well-being.
Get your Sealpro silage barrier film today. Protect the seed, fertilizer, labor, and expensive inputs that you've invested in. Choose best-in-class Sealpro now in 3 different versions: traditional 2-roll application, our new co-rolled application, and super simple and wildly successful 1-layer film, Sealpro 1. It's easy to buy, easy to use. Contractor covering? We'll work with them. Learn more at sealprosilage.com. That's SEALPRO silage.com. Family owned and operated for over 25 years. 559-779-5961. That's 559-779-5961. Is frozen colostrum as high? Is there any damage that's done when you freeze colostrum?
That's a really good question. In fact, there's Dr. Laturo Cangiano at the University of Wisconsin, who was out of Mike Steele's lab out of Guelph, is actually working on that a little bit more extensively recently, but there has been some past studies that have looked at that. The differences are minor between frozen and fresh colostrum, but there are differences. And part of that is immune information transfer from cow to calf. But if you don't have a choice, I would always use frozen colostrum versus no colostrum or poor quality colostrum that's not properly fortified.
Let's talk about fortification. So you do your testing, you figure out, oh, this colostrum is not, I don't have colostrum that's of high enough quality. What about fortification?
That's where we Dr. Sockett and I collaborated a bit, and we used his model to look at, okay, can we use and essentially developed an app that uses the accuracy of his equations and model to develop how much fortification would be needed to feed that calf properly. The app essentially only requires 3 inputs when it comes right down to it. First of all, what volume do you want to feed? To Dr. Sockett's point, some people are comfortable with the 4 quarts, okay, but if they would rather feed 3 quarts or 3.5 quarts or 2.5 quarts, in a feeding, how much do you want to restrict it to, and how much for the second feeding? For example, someone might put in 3 quarts and 2 quarts for the second feeding. Next input is the body weight of the calf. That determines how much IgG that calf needs, because a larger calf obviously needs more, a smaller calf needs less. The last one is, of course, the Brix reading or the colostrum quality. And so with those 3 bits of information, the app will actually determine if fortification is necessary. And if not, and to Dr. Sockett's point earlier, there's times where they may even feed less than their maximum allowed. And so if the maximum allowed is 3 quarts, they may only need 2.5. It gives them that opportunity. And so that's how we basically pulled this all together and gave people options. To me, it's not for us to decide what you want your maximums to be or what your operation's going to have for a protocol, but at least be able to give you the options of choosing lesser quantities and then deciding whether you tube feed or bottle feed or whatever you do with those quantities.
And what's the name of that app?
Is kind of an envelope app that's called Caddy Insights, but the app itself is called Colostrum Management Tool, and it's part of Caddy Insights. And there's a long explanation for those names, but essentially the bottom line is developed as part of a package of apps that we have at Land Lakes and Purina. With our partners at Purina and Land Lakes, we've been able to develop options for people to do what's best for their calf in regards to colostrum management. And so we have not only at PurinaMills.com, but also through people like Dr. Sockett and your Purina representative. You can get more information on any of this. And we'll also have links for the studies that Dr. Sockett mentioned as well.
I'd like to say that we investigated fortification quite a bit because we are concerned, can you add too much and make it too concentrated, which we have a way to measure that, which we call osmolality. And so we've checked that with a whole different range of BRIC scores, and the app is limited. It will limit how much you can colostrum replacement powder you can add. So we're not concerned about getting a colostrum you feed the calf where the osmolality is too high. But one thing we did learn when I was fortifying all these colostrum samples, boy, it really matters the product you use, because some of the products, the osmolality will be too high. So you have to use a product that's been checked and verified that it's safe to fortify the colostrum with.
And that's, I would guess, where the app comes in too, that it would give you a more accurate reading of how much fortification you need.
Yes.
Tom, anything you wanted to add that we didn't cover?
I think I'll steal Dr. Sockett's statement that he's made before in the past. The key to this to me is that we want to be able to give people the option of driving the right amount of IgG into the calf and thinking in terms of the mass of IgG versus the volume. And it was a very crude system that we initially had, and it was adequate at the time, but this is much better, much more accurate for the animal, and can result in much better results from a calf well-being standpoint.
So this is what it is. We have to fundamentally think about what we're delivering to the calf. We have to think about the mass of hemoglobin. We're delivering the correct mass of hemoglobin, so we know we'll have successful transfer of passive immunity. And then you want to feed it in the smallest volume possible, because that's the winning ticket. Because you'll have healthier calves, increased farm supply. It's just a win-win-win situation.
Well, thank you both for a great discussion on colostrum, things that I'd never thought about before. All right. Well, thank you. We've been talking to Dr. Don Sockett, epidemiologist and microbiologist for the University of Wisconsin Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory, and to Dr. Tom Earleywine, who is Director of Nutritional Services at Purina Animal Nutrition. Thank you both for the discussion today. I really appreciate it. I'm Connie Kuber with Sealpro Silage Barrier Film by Connor AgriScience, and you have been listening to the Dairy Voice by Dairy Business News. Please subscribe, like, and share this podcast with all your friends. We appreciate the care and perseverance of all dairy farmers, and we especially want to remind you in the midst of harvest to stay hydrated, stay rested, and fed, just like your calves. So thank you for listening, and we'll talk again very soon.